welcome to Scorekeeping. Today we are going to cover Game of Thrones. HBO's massively popular fantasy show, Game of Thrones, is always evoking the medieval. From the armor and weapons to the dialogue and dragons, the whole thing is like a Ren fair. But like, with a budget. The biggest budget ever. But shows like these use more than just props and costumes to shape their complete universes, and the world of Game of Thrones is sold by the music as much as by anything else. The Game of Thrones theme is powerful, exciting music, and it seems to fit perfectly with everything we see in Westeros.
But why is that?
Well, music from a similar time on Earth, the medieval period, sounded a lot like this, and very different from what we hear today. Modern films, games, and TV mostly use music based on a system called tonality. In tonal music, there's a repeating scale with 7 notes. They all relate to each other, but we're going to focus on the ones that largely control musical beginnings and endings. 1 and 7, the 1 and 7 scale degrees. We start most songs with the chord built on the first note of the scale, go through any number of other chords, then the 5 chord, and that leads back to 1. That sounds like this. In tonal music, we call that a cadence. Now, the 7th scale degree is one of the most active ingredients in that relationship, and most modern listeners would always want to hear it slide up to 1. It's like 7 isn't stable on its own. It creates a tension, and that tension will only be released by hearing 7 slide up to 1. 7 comes before 1. Before 1.
I know. Music is weird.
That's called a cadence in tonal music. But in medieval music, they hadn't developed that norm yet. In that time, church chant dominated music, and the chant alternative to a cadence was called the final. The final was also the 7th place in the scale, the note right below 1, but the scales didn't all work like tonal scales do. Back then, the 7th was usually lower. It was a whole step away instead of a half step away, like we have in the modern tonal cadence. That might not sound so incredibly different to you, but it's enough for your ear to notice, and it dog whistles to every viewer that this music is supposed to sound old. Something else this music does not do, which helps it sound antique, is play the 3rd of the chord very much. In modern tonalism, a chord is 3 notes played together, each one 3 scale degrees apart. But medieval chant was such early music that harmony that we can recognize wouldn't be invented for a while. Then, chant was sung 1 pitch at a time in unison. Harmony even kind of became a political issue. The Catholic Church argued at the Council of Trent that it obscured the words and wasn't suitable for godly church music.
That devil music!
It seems kind of crazy that you could ban harmony, but that's what they were trying to do. That was a real thing then. Eventually, though, an early version of harmony called organum was allowed into music. Organum is when only 2 notes are played together, 4 or 5 scale degrees above the chant melody, sometimes an octave, harmonizing in parallel lockstep with it, and it really does sound different than a chord. Once organum was allowed in the public space, it exploded in popularity, and eventually it featured on most compositions, and the Game of Thrones theme uses this to sound medieval. The theme starts on the 5th note of the scale and falls to the 1st note of the scale. That sounds like this. That outlines the 1 chord without its 3rd, just like organum. But in the 2nd phrase, the whole thing moves down a whole step. And now, the falling 5th goes from the 4th to the 7th scale degree. Now that's a whole step below 1, just like that medieval final. So it's kind of a combination trick. He's like layering ye olde music ideas to tell us that this music is supposed to sound old. The last thing about the Game of Thrones theme to notice are the instruments and timbres they use. The show's composer, Ramin Djawadi, said that the creators wanted a darker sound, quote unquote. So he chose the cello to play the melody. But it's an interesting choice for another reason. Cello is the modern descendant of an old early music instrument called a viola da gamba. The viola da gamba was used outside of church music, in folk and popular songs, and later it found its way into early versions of the orchestra for all kinds of music. Using this instrument definitely fits into the old style world that the composer is trying to create. Another sound the theme uses to get its effect is percussion. It might not be historically grounded to use percussion and drums in that way. There was no guy like tapping away on his tambourine in the middle of church. But composers have used percussion, especially heavy rhythmic beats, as a trope for the underdeveloped or old. Later in history, a famous Russian composer, Igor Stravinsky, used percussion and low, heavy rhythms in his ballet, The Rite of Spring, to characterize the brutalist sound of old pagan rites. Similarly, Djawadi adds heavy percussion to the already sparing melody and harmony, which adds to the overall old-school landscape of the music. When you take it all together, the instruments, old-style modal scales, emphasis on fifths and percussion, do kind of succeed at making this music sound similar to medieval and Renaissance music. And it puts you in the right frame of mind for all that classic Game of Thrones intrigue and carnage before they even show you one character or sigil. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe. I'll have more of these kind of videos out whenever I can. I'm a working musician, and so it may not be every week, but I hope to have a number of things, a lot of content out. There's a little bell. You can hit the button with the bell to subscribe. That way you get all the content as soon as I make it. And have an awesome day. Thanks for watching.